Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on leading a virtual team. Before we jump into the content, I'd be remiss if I didn't acknowledge the many challenges that we're facing on a personal and a professional perspective. Many of us are parents, and we're now tasked with homeschooling our kids, where we're trying to continue with our careers, perhaps run our own businesses. I myself have two boys that are downstairs right now on their iPads, hopefully doing the latest math lesson that their teacher assigned. From a professional perspective, many of us are now working in remote offices and learning different modes of work. Perhaps our organizations have let people go and now are being tasked to do more with less. My hope for today is that I provide you with a series of strategies and tactics that you can apply immediately after this webinar to go back into help leading a virtual team. But something to keep in mind is that this is definitely not a one-size-fits-all. Similar to the way I think about best practices aren't meant to be copy and pasted and directly applied. Not all of us can be like Elon Musk and simultaneously launch 3 unicorn companies. So I would inspire you and encourage you to take what I say today and make sure that it fits with your personality, with your team, and with the culture of your organization. As I go through the slides, please use the Q&A feature, click the Q&A button at the bottom, and log questions that I'll try to answer at the end. If I don't have time, I'll follow up with an email with my responses to some of the questions. So let's jump right in. The first thing to think about in terms of leading a virtual team really is about mindset. And mindset is something that I work with every single executive that I coach. That's where we start. Well, they may say, hey, I want to boost my executive presence. I want to be a better decision maker. I want to be a better communicator. We all start with a lot of the mindsets, and that's where we're going to start today. The first mindset shift is just to acknowledge that virtual teams are indeed different. I've seen many managers and leaders try to take their exact method of leading an in-person team over into a virtual environment and assume that things are going to be exactly the same, and they stumble and often fall right on their face. It's important for us to acknowledge that things are different. The mode of working is different. Our communication needs to be adapted based on this new virtual environment where we're in these far-flung offices and we're not face-to-face every single day. The second mindset is just around the productivity of virtual teams. And yes, our virtual teams will definitely take a hit from a productivity perspective right out of the gate, especially if it's an abrupt change like we're all experiencing within the last couple of weeks. But if managed correctly, over time, a virtual team can be, if not as, potentially even more productive than their in-person counterparts. If we're focusing on improving communication and perhaps some of the benefits that were gained by lost productivity around some of that water cooler time and unproductive conversations that typically happen in an office environment. But one word of caution is that it's important for us to, as leaders, to make sure that we're not just focused on the transactional part of the work environment, but we're also building teams, we're building connections, we're building bridges between people in different teams and in different functions, different parts of the organization. So the point is that these teams, virtually that is, can be as productive, potentially even more productive than in-person teams. The next mindset is really around trust, and that trust is paramount to the success of virtual teams. Google did a study several years ago called Project Aristotle, where they studied all the different teams across their organization. They were trying to look for what were the different factors that led to high performance. They looked at the individual competency and aptitude of the team members. They looked at all sorts of variables. And what they found was that the best teams were those that had psychological safety. Psychological safety, so they had enough confidence where they could lean into a meeting, provide perhaps a contrarian view, express their perspectives without taking backlash from their team members, or worse yet, their boss. And in virtual teams, trust is even that much more important. We're not in front of each other every single day, seeing each other what we're doing. Managers can't view the direct progress of their direct reports. So trust is really important. And some of the exercises that I'm going to discuss in the communication and engagement section of today's webinar will really help to build some of that trust. The last piece from a mindset perspective is we have to model it. If we're expecting our teams to communicate in a new way, to have different modes of working, it's absolutely critical that we model it. We don't set a guideline for, hey, here's how we're going to work, here's how we're going to communicate, and then constantly undermine ourselves by doing something different. If we ask our people to communicate using a certain medium that we're going to talk about in a moment, that it's critical that we actually follow the own rules, that we eat our own dog food, if you will. The next section really is around the setup in the strategy. How can we get our virtual teams off on the right foot? Perhaps it's a new team that's being formed, or in this case, just given this abrupt shift to a virtual environment, is what are some of the strategies that we can do to set our teams up for success? The first is around confirming our team mission, our goals, our North Star. Many times when we have a radical shift like we all have had in the last couple of weeks, a lot of people have a lot of sense of uncertainty and fear based on this new shift to a virtual environment. Is my role going to change? Is our organization going to perhaps lay people off because we're now in this virtual environment? And if we can get back and recenter on what is the mission of our team, what are the goals of our team and our organization, it can do a lot to damp down some of that fear that some of us might be experiencing. But also looking at it from a goals perspective, you might need to shift some of those goals, especially what's happened looking back even a month ago, where we were all in hyper growth phase and we were looking for new opportunities to grow and keep that upward trajectory going. Now we're in a rapid cost cutting environment where companies are shedding costs at a record pace so that they can stay on track, given that the marketplace has shifted so radically. So it's important to really think about reconfirming or confirming the team mission, reconfirming the goals, or perhaps adjusting them if things have changed, especially now with the business conditions. That's one key thing from a setup and a strategy perspective. The second thing is just clarifying roles and responsibilities. When we shift from that in-person mode of working to virtual, surely there's going to be some roles and responsibilities that have shifted, especially things that aren't necessarily documented in any kind of roles and responsibilities document, things that are taken for granted. Perhaps there's a person who always is the de facto facilitator and scribe in a meeting. Perhaps that's going to change now that the person is not in front of people. But also, maybe the person who leads culture activities and happy hours, because they're situated right next to the CEO, that will now shift and perhaps will select the person that's the best fit for the job. Those are just two examples, but the point is that roles and responsibilities surely will shift, and it's important that we can help clarify those roles and responsibilities and adapt any that may have changed. It'll help give people a greater sense of security and to make sure that we're going to be aligned in terms of what the team and what the organization is trying to achieve. Like with anything in leadership, it's really important to co-create these and to adjust these with your team members, whether it's in a group meeting or whether it's even just one-to-one. But co-creation is a really great strategy in terms of working with your teams, especially in a dynamic environment like the one that we're in today. The last piece in terms of the setup is around creating a team charter. And I'm sure many of you have a team charter in place, but a team charter will capture some of the things that we just talked about around the team mission, the vision, the goals, roles and responsibilities of the team overall, as well as the individuals. But it also captures some of the work processes. How does work get done? How are decisions made? How are we going to communicate, which we're going to talk about in a minute. But what are some of those guidelines for communications that we want to establish as a team? So if you don't have a team charter, it's a great time to create one once we move from this in-person to a virtual environment. But it's really a great chance, whether it's a new team or a team that's had a shift underfoot like the one that we've had in the last couple of weeks. The next section is around communication. And communication is such a critical element of leading a virtual team. And it's something that we really need to be mindful of as we shift from an in-person environment where we can see the people in front of us, we can read their body language, we can communicate really effectively, and make sure that we're mindful of that as we move into a virtual environment. The first suggestion is related back to the team charter, which is about creating team guidelines, perhaps a checklist around how we should communicate in a virtual team. And it's important for a couple of reasons. One is that when we shift from a in-person to a virtual environment, there can just be a lot of fragmented communications because now we're using text, we're using phone calls, we're having video calls, we're using Slack or Microsoft Teams, we're using Google Docs, all these different collaboration tools that can be fragmented, and we could have information that's caught in all of these different silos and no cohesive way to access all that information. But also we can have communication overload. If we're just pummeling people with Slack messages and texts if we don't get a response, or picking up the phone, we're just going to overload people, which is going to really impact individual and team productivity and can also lead to conflict. So as a manager, it's important to set some of those guidelines. It doesn't have to be written in stone per se, but just to give some suggestions. Here's the types of tools we're going to use. Here's some guidelines around response times, which is really important given we're not in front of each other every single moment of the day. But how should we respond? When should we respond? During the workday, during nights, during weekends? Many organizations, investment banks, are pretty much on a 24/7 cadence, but that may not fit your culture within your team. So it's really important to define that, but also remember, be sure to model it. Because if we establish these guidelines, we say, hey, give the person an hour to respond to this kind of message, and we violate that by sending a message and we pick up the phone immediately because we don't get a response, that's going to really undermine our efforts in terms of creating some of these standards and guidelines around effective communications. The next piece is around considering the tone and the format of a message, but also the audience. When we're not face to face with people, we don't have the benefit of reading their facial expressions, if they have a furrowed brow, if they're folding their arms like this. And it's really important that we take that extra effort and not be lazy, and to communicate and to consider that tone and the format. Think about punctuation. Think about the brevity of the response. Think about how direct you're being. And because all of those things can start to create conflict, which is ultimately going to hinder the productivity of the team, as well as lower the engagement, potentially even lowering and increasing turnover within a team and an organization. But also, perhaps even more importantly, is thinking about who's the audience that you're communicating with. So many of us communicate in the style that we would like to be communicated with, in terms of the tempo, the style, the word choice, the directness, the amount of data that's used. It's really critical to consider who's in that other chair, who's on the other end of that call or on the other end of that video call, and what is it their preferred mode of communicating. I use an assessment called the Strengths Deployment Inventory, and it looks at your individual motives and strengths. So the motives are why you do what you do, and the strengths are how you get work done. And people may be motivated by performance. They're constantly focused on outcomes and greater goal achievement. Then there are folks that are motivated by people. They like a lot of in-person, warm interactions. The first 5 minutes of a meeting is all about person, about family, about how they're doing, what's going on in their personal life, and it's less about jumping right into the business topics. You also have folks who are really motivated by data and details and following a rigid process, which is very different than someone who's performance-oriented or people-oriented. You also have people who are motivated by consensus, by collaboration, by having a lot of different options that they can choose. And those motives can come into conflict with one another. So it's really important to consider, what are the motives of the other people that you're communicating with? Even if you don't have the benefit of an assessment like the one I mentioned, still consider, how have they communicated in the past? Do they use a lot of bullet points? Are they direct and to the point? Do they spend a lot of time asking about our personal life? If you consider those things, it goes a long way to boosting productivity, to creating higher levels of engagement, and reducing some of that erosive conflict that can happen in teams. The end result is less conflict and greater engagement. The next tip from a communications perspective is just to provide regular updates. It sounds simple, but in an office environment where we can bump into each other in the hallways, we're in a lot of meetings, we can overhear conversations from the other cubicles and of other executives speaking. In a virtual environment, it's really important that we can have a streamlined set of communications. It's all about being proactive and not just assuming that things are just going to travel through the grapevine throughout your team and your organization. But also be wary of those rapid fire staccato-like updates, and you're not just hammering them with different messages and updates using the different mediums. So it gets back to some of that checklist around the communications guidelines, so that we're providing those regular updates. One idea is to batch updates, perhaps create a weekly newsletter that talks about the state of the state within our team, within our organization, or maybe even hold a town hall where we're all on video, we're providing updates, we're going around the horn in terms of providing some of those critical updates that it's happening internally within our team, but also outside of our four walls and into the marketplace and what our consumers are thinking and feeling. But don't just focus on yourself. Provide some of these guidelines to your team members? How should they provide these updates? What's the frequency? What's the medium? What's the level of detail that they should be including in these updates? So it's not just for yourself, but it's providing some of those guidelines for updates from your team members as well. The next communication tip is around rethinking collaboration. And while in-office environments use a lot of the tools like Slack and Google Docs and so forth, when you shift from this in-person to a virtual environment, you no longer have the benefit of this whiteboard over here and getting in front of it, and we can all jump up with our different colored markers and to collaborate on different things. It's going to require some different modes of working. And also, it's really helpful to take advantage of some of these incredible collaboration tools. There's a digital whiteboard in Zoom. There's also Google Docs. There's a variety of different tools that you can use to help facilitate collaboration. The other thing is, even if we're heads down on our laptops in a group collaboration session, it really helps to fire up the video. I know in personal experience, we didn't have videos on, and while most of the time we were looking at our screen, just being able to see the person's expression, it just brought so much more life to the session and really turbocharged our collaboration. But also, be careful, just because you can doesn't mean you need to collaborate on every single thing. It's really important to think about who needs to be involved in different conversations, how are we going down the funnel of this collaboration and different ideas, who should be involved at different stages, and so forth. So really, it's important to think about all the different tools, but also who needs to be involved in these different collaborative efforts, because collaboration is going to look and feel different in a virtual environment. The last piece on communication is around maintaining meeting hygiene. And when we're in an office environment, it's easy to do things like to stay on time from a start and a stop perspective in meetings. Consider you've booked the conference room and there's a person behind the glass window who's waving at you, you're done, meeting's over, you're booked, you're past your time, we need to move in there. But you don't necessarily have that luxury in a virtual environment. Oftentimes I've seen teams that just, the meetings will bleed over, oh, we want an extra 5 minutes or 10 minutes. It's really critical to stay on task, especially given some teams now perhaps have some slack in their days because they're waiting for the marketplace to create some level of certainty, or a lot of their customers are offline dealing with a lot of their personal and professional issues as well. So stay on track, maintain a strict start and an end time. The second thing is around making sure that you're involving every single person that's on the conversation. In an in-person meeting, you can see their perspectives, you can read their body language, perhaps their furrowed brow. You know when you want to call on them, you want to engage with them, you want to give them a chance to speak their mind on a specific topic. But you don't always have that in a virtual environment. One great way is just to make sure you fire up that video at all times. I'm sure many of you are getting video overload, being constant on video, feel like you can never get a break. But it's really important to make sure that people are engaged, and video is a great way to do that. Another thing is to limit multitasking. And that's a huge problem when you go to any kind of virtual calls, especially if it's just an audio only conference call. People are texting, people are sending emails, they're not engaged. So it's really important to limit that multitasking, which is another thing that you can include in your team charter as well as your communication guidelines. The next section, which is part 4, which is about how do you engage your team? And engaging your team goes way beyond just communicating. And it's an important aspect because we're not in front of each other anymore. And we want to keep that engagement going so that we can keep the productivity high, we can keep the engagement level high, and we can ultimately be sure that we hit the goals of our team and our organization. The first thing from an engagement perspective is to make time to connect. When we're in the office, we're running into people at the water cooler, in the company gym, in the kitchen, and it gives us a chance to talk about some of those issues that are more near and dear to our heart, perhaps some of the personal issues that are going on. Whereas we get into a virtual situation, and those calls just tend to jump right into the topics that tend to be more transactional in nature, as it only pertains to what's going on from a business perspective. And while that's great from a productivity perspective, it's that balance, and it's really important to make sure that you allow time to connect. I worked with Keith Ferrazzi for a long time, and one of the things that he likes to incorporate in meetings is he does what's called a personal and professional check-in, where you go around the room and each person takes about a minute or two to give an update on what's going on in their personal life and what's going on in their professional life. As a leader, it's really important that he talks about is to model it and to go first to establish that right level of vulnerability and how much you want to share. So it's important to make time to connect. There's a lot of different tips and tactics you can do. It can be team building exercises, but the point is to make sure that you focus not just on the actual work that gets done, but in terms of building the team, building that camaraderie, and making sure you have time to connect is a great way to do so. The next thing is not to hide behind a digital curtain. And so many of us would get so busy when we're working from our home offices that we're just hammering away emails and Slack messages and text messages and phone calls. It's important just to jump in front of that curtain, just to really humanize some of that connection. And the video cameras are not just a one size fits all. They're not just a silver bullet to solve this problem, but it really is important to not just hide behind the curtain, especially because a lot of our communication norms and hygiene can just go out the window when we're typing things, we're texting things, we're not considering the tone, we're not taking as much time to think about who we're speaking with and the different style, the words that we choose, and how we direct we are. So it's important just to not hide behind that digital curtain, use the video, but also consider when you're communicating, even if it's using a digital tool, just to be wary of who you're communicating with, what is the tone, and what are the words you're choosing. Another tactic is to hold virtual open office hours. And so much of an office environment are characterized by office drive-bys, where someone will come and say, hey, can I get 2 minutes? And that 2 minutes accordions out into 30 minutes, perhaps even an hour, and eventually your whole day is shot. And while that's great to make yourself open and available to your team, it can also be very disruptive. Much like in a digital environment, if you're hammering people with texts, with different communications, it can really start to impact the productivity and can ultimately lead to conflict, which is why those guidelines are really important. But one thing to do is to hold virtual office hours. That way you can force people to batch some of their questions into a narrow time window. Also really helps to let your team know that, hey, I'm available, I'm here for you. I'm not just available when you request an ad hoc meeting, but I'm actually being intentional to carve out an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours of my week, just specifically to help and develop my team members. It just goes a long way to produce productivity, but also to increase engagement in your team. The last section I want to talk about, especially with just how much heaviness there is, just given the expansion of the coronavirus, is some tips to keep it fun and how we can stay healthy, both from a mental but a physical perspective. One fun idea is to hold virtual home tours. Grab your phone, grab your laptop, walk around your house, and give people a sense for what's in your environment. What are the pictures and posters you have on your wall? In this case, your golden retriever that sleeps on your bed in your workspace, perhaps. Let them see your kids who are doing homework, your dog, your cat. So they'll give you that a little bit more benefit of the doubt when the dog's barking on the call, or perhaps the cat's walking behind you when you're on a video conference call. Or for me, what happened this week was I was on a coaching call and I felt these two little hands reach around my neck, and my oldest son gave me a hug. It was a little embarrassing, and I'm glad my client gave me the pass on that. But it just, doing these home tours allows people to give you that benefit of the doubt. And it's just a fun activity to do, and it just creates a lot of connection and a lot of warmth within teams. The second thing is just to exercise regularly. When we're in an office, we get some exercise, some steps going up and down the stairs or walking around the office park, or perhaps we walk to lunch every day. And we can become incredibly sedentary, especially with the quarantines that are hitting, and to do what you can to exercise regularly. If you have an elliptical machine at home, or even if you can just do some sit-ups or push-ups, or even just walking around the block if you can, or walking around your apartment, just finding some way to get exercise, because it goes a long way and it translates towards having a healthy mind, one that's clear, that you can focus, so you can persevere through some of these challenging situations. The second thing is about focusing on your mind and keeping a clear mind. I think it's really important, whether it's prayer, whether it's meditation, but to do things that allow you to slow down and to pause and to relax your mind so you can have better focus and you can deal with a lot of the challenges, some of those roadblocks and obstacles that are getting thrown in our way. And some of you may think this is squishy. It took me a while to get to focus and be willing to do meditation, but in working with a lot of Navy SEALs, they do something that's similar. They do a lot of breathing exercises prior to going into combat and to really stressful situations. where they'll breathe in for 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, 3 Mississippi, 4 Mississippi. Then they hold it for 4 Mississippis and then out for 4 Mississippis. And they repeat that several times. What that does is it slows their heart rate, allows them to be focused and calm. And to me, if it's good enough for Navy SEALs, this is some techniques that definitely work for me. I've used it to help me deal with some of the things in the day, whether it's a meditation at the start of the day to get me centered, to take on what's coming in front of me, or whether it's something at the end of the day, or perhaps even in the middle of the night to deal with some of the stress and help you unwind and get a good night's rest. Try it for 5 minutes. There's some great apps. I personally use Calm. I know some friends and colleagues who use an app called Headspace, but just a lot of great tools out there. There's a lot of free ones, freemium ones. Also, of course, there's a number of subscription models as well. But being healthy, both body and mind, is really helpful, especially as we're moving to this new virtual environment. The last tip is around holding virtual happy hours. Some of my favorite memories from my time working at Accenture and at Gap in San Francisco was walking to boulevards or slanted door and having a cocktail, having a beer, and just really connecting with my colleagues, especially after a stressful week. And there's so much stress right now. And I know many people are having these virtual happy hours with their friends and their family, but try it with your colleagues. Perhaps end the day 30 minutes early, whether that's 5:30 or 4:30, or perhaps even later in the evening, and open up your favorite can of beer, pour yourself a glass of wine or your favorite non-alcoholic beverage or seltzer water, and toast those glasses virtually, and find that way to connect and intersect and reflect on some of the challenges, not just professionally, but personally. It goes a long way in terms of creating some of those connections that really are going to be helpful in bolstering our teams, bolstering our organizations, and thriving in this state of uncertainty. That's all the content that I have for today, but definitely wanted to try to answer a couple of questions here. So the first one that I see is, how do I deal with team members who are struggling? That's a great question. And I think really it's the same, whether it's an in-person environment or in a virtual environment. It's being human. It's having empathy. Look, we're all facing some really big struggles right now, both professionally and personally. It can go a long way towards just having some empathy, having greater understanding. But also take that coach approach with your team members and really showing up and being present, being active from a listening perspective, asking questions that are not about you driving to an endpoint, but really questions that can prompt some greater introspection, some greater awareness of new opportunities. That's really helpful. The second question is, how do I keep my team motivated? And this is similar also in terms of, it's the same as in an in-person environment. I think a couple of tactics that really help is focus on the why. When you ask a team member to do a new task, to take on a new project, it really helps to pull them back to the why you're doing that task, how it connects to the mission of the organization and the mission of the team. That really can create a lot of motivation to achieve whatever that task is, especially during times like now with great uncertainty. Another tip is to allow them to use their strengths every single day in the work that they're doing. And Gallup did a study several years back that looked at teams that took a strengths-based approach, meaning that they allowed their team members to focus on the things that they do best. And they compared those to teams that don't take a strengths-based approach. And you could see that obviously profitability, sales went up, but most importantly, as it pertains to this conversation, is that team engagement and even customer engagement went up throughout the process when you took this strengths-based approach. But also, the number one factor in determining an employee's success is that relationship with you as a leader. You're the most important relationship, so be that coach to them. Show up and be present. Have empathy. Be an active listener. Ask questions. Focus on their development and what they're trying to achieve, not so much what you're trying to achieve. So that's all for today. Thank you for listening in. Please reach out if you have any questions. I'm here to support you. We're in a very different and very challenging environment. I think on the back end, hopefully we're going to come out better for it. But there's definitely a lot of stress, a lot of uncertainty. I'm here for you. Please send any emails to Darren@group60.com. It was in the webinar invite. I'll also post it on LinkedIn afterwards. But take care and be well. Goodbye.